Winter 1942-43. A German ordnance workshop behind the front. The vehicle on the trestles had been captured intact, and the mechanics stripping it had orders that were entirely routine by that stage of the war. Germany examined everything it took from its enemies. Captured tanks went to the proving grounds. Captured guns were fired and measured. Captured vehicles were driven, tested, and taken to pieces so that the army could learn what the other side knew. This one was small, 80 inches of wheelbase, no doors, no roof, a folding windscreen, and a body made of flat steel panels that looked as though they had been cut with tin snips. They took the engine down, a 4-cylinder side valve unit of about 2.2 liters, producing around 60 horsepower, an ordinary commercial car engine of a type any European manufacturer could have built in 1935. They pulled the transfer case, the axles, the transmission. They examined the frame, the suspension, the fasteners, and they found nothing. No exotic alloy, no advanced metallurgy, no manufacturing technique Germany could not match, no component that would have puzzled a competent mechanic in Stuttgart or Rüsselsheim. Every part in that vehicle was something German industry had been capable of producing for a decade. That was the discovery, and it was more unsettling than finding a secret would have been. The Americans had not built something Germany could not build. They had built something Germany would never have thought to build, and then made 640,000 of them. Section 1. The contract nobody wanted, July 1940. The United States Army wanted a light reconnaissance car, something to replace the motorcycle and sidecar, which was fast, cheap, and useless the moment the ground turned soft. The specification went out to 135 American manufacturers, with a deadline so aggressive it bordered on insulting, a running prototype in 49 days. 3 companies replied. Willys Overland replied, Ford replied, and the American Bantam Car Company replied, which mattered most, because Bantam was the smallest of the 3 by an enormous margin, a nearly bankrupt firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, that built tiny economy cars and had almost no engineering staff left to speak of. Bantam had no designer available, so it brought in a freelance engineer named Karl Probst, initially without pay. Probst laid out the vehicle in a matter of days, and Bantam had a running prototype at Camp Holabird inside the deadline. It worked. The Army testers drove it through everything they could find and concluded the concept was sound. Then the Army did something ruthless, and it is the part of this story that deserves to be told honestly. Bantam was judged too small to produce the vehicle in the numbers a war would require. So the Army made Bantam's design data available to Willys and to Ford, and invited them to build their own versions. Willys came back with essentially the same vehicle fitted with a considerably stronger engine. Ford came back with its own version and, more importantly, with the capacity to build anything in enormous quantity. The final standardized design drew on all 3, but the production contracts went to Willys and Ford. Bantam, the company that had actually created it, built a few thousand early examples and then spent the rest of the war making trailers. The vehicle that emerged was the Willys MB, and Ford built the identical thing under license as the GPW. Between them, they produced roughly 640,000. Section 2. The Tyranny of the Weight Limit, 1940. Camp Holabird, Maryland. To understand why German mechanics found nothing clever inside a Jeep, you have to understand the specification, because the specification is where all the cleverness went. The Army wanted 4-wheel drive. It wanted a payload of 600 pounds. It wanted a folding windscreen, a specific track width to fit existing wheel ruts, blackout lighting, and a vehicle low enough to hide behind a hedge. And in the original requirement, it wanted the whole thing to weigh about 1,300 pounds. That figure was close to impossible, and it was eventually relaxed, but the discipline it imposed shaped everything. Every single component had to justify its mass. There was no allowance for a part that was heavier than it needed to be, because heavier felt sturdier, and no room whatsoever for decoration, comfort, or refinement. The engine that won was the Willys unit, universally known as the Go Devil, a side valve 4 of about 134 cubic inches, making roughly 60 horsepower and, more importantly, a healthy amount of torque low in the rev range. It was not a sophisticated engine. Its valve layout was old-fashioned even in 1940. What it was unburstable, easy to build, easy to understand, and strong enough to haul a fully loaded vehicle up a slope in four-wheel drive without complaint. The rest followed the same logic. The body was flat steel panels, because flat panels can be stamped or cut and welded by anybody, and a damaged one can be beaten straight with a hammer. The frame was a simple ladder. The suspension was leaf springs. There was no synchro mesh on the lowest gear, no heater, no radio, no doors, and no roof worth the name. Nothing on that vehicle existed, unless it made the vehicle go, stop, steer, or carry. The Germans, examining it, were looking at the result of a design process in which sophistication had been treated as a defect. Section 3. Built to be fixed by someone who doesn't understand it. This is the part the mechanics would have registered fastest, because mechanics always do. The Jeep was designed around a specific and slightly insulting assumption that the person repairing it would be a 19-year-old with no mechanical training, working in the dark, in the rain, several miles from anyone who knew better, with only the tools carried on the vehicle itself, so everything was accessible. The engine sat in a bay with room around it. Components that were known to fail were placed where a hand could reach them, without removing 3 other components first. Fasteners were standard sizes, and there were as few different sizes as possible, so a small handful of spanners covered the whole vehicle. Where a part could be made to serve 2 purposes, it was. Compare that to the design philosophy of a fine European vehicle of the period, where components were packaged tightly and elegantly, on the reasonable assumption that servicing would be done by a trained mechanic in a workshop with a full set of tools and a manual. That assumption is perfectly sound in peacetime. It collapses in a war of movement, where the workshop is 200 miles behind you and the vehicle is needed tonight. The Jeep also came apart and went back together in ways that were unusual. Shipping space across the Atlantic and the Pacific was the tightest constraint the Allies faced, so Jeeps were frequently shipped knocked down, crated in pieces, packed several to the space one assembled vehicle would occupy, and reassembled at the destination by ordinary soldiers working from instructions. A vehicle that can be built by its users in a field is a vehicle designed with a very particular kind of humility. It could be lifted. 4 men could shift one bodily out of a ditch. It could be carried inside a transport aircraft, towed behind a truck, landed from a boat, and dropped from a glider. None of that is engineering brilliance in the conventional sense. All of it is the result of asking, at every single decision point, one question that German designers of the era asked less often: what will this be like for the man who has to use it and fix it? Section 4. The part that was actually impossible to copy. Now, the thing that would have troubled a German ordnance officer most, once the vehicle was back together and the report was being written, Ford did not build a Ford version of the Jeep. Ford built the Jeep, the same vehicle, to the same drawings, and its parts interchanged with the parts Willys made. 2 independent corporations, 2 separate factories, producing components that fitted each other's vehicles without adjustment. A German unit capturing an American Jeep in Tunisia and another in Normandy could take the axle from one and fit it to the other. So could an American mechanic, which was rather the point. Set that against the situation inside the German army, which was, by any measure, one of the worst logistical problems of the war. The Wehrmacht operated an enormous number of different vehicle types. German industry had produced many competing models before the war, and the army then absorbed whole national vehicle fleets as it conquered: French, Czech, Austrian, Italian, Belgian, Dutch. A German division might operate dozens of different makes across its transport, each with its own parts, its own tools, its own manuals, and its own failure modes. Germany was fully aware of this. In 1938, it appointed an officer, Adolf von Schell, specifically to rationalize the situation, with authority to cut the number of models being produced. The program genuinely reduced the catalog of German-built types substantially, and was then overwhelmed, because conquest kept adding foreign vehicles faster than standardization could remove German ones. So the 2 armies had opposite problems. The American army had one light vehicle, built by 2 firms, in a single interchangeable specification, 640,000 times. The German army had an enormous fleet made up of a bewildering number of types, in which a broken vehicle frequently could not be repaired because the part it needed had been made in a factory that was now in a different country, or in a country that was now an enemy. The Jeep's most important component was not on the vehicle. It was the crate of identical spare parts sitting in a depot 400 miles away, and the certainty that every one of them would fit. That was the thing German industry could not reproduce, not because it lacked the skill, but because it had spent the previous decade going in the opposite direction. Section 5. Germany's own answer. Assessed honestly 1940. Wolfsburg. It would be easy and wrong to say Germany had no equivalent. It had two, and both were clever. The Volkswagen Kübelwagen was a light military car built on the Volkswagen chassis, air-cooled, rear-engined, very light, with a limited slip differential and good ground clearance. Around 50,000 were built. There was also the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious version with four-wheel drive and a propeller that folded down over the stern, of which some 14,000 were made, and which remains one of the most ingenious small military vehicles ever produced. Honesty requires acknowledging that the Kübelwagen beat the Jeep in several real respects, and German troops who used both said so. It was substantially lighter, which mattered more than people expect. In deep mud or soft sand, a light vehicle that two men can push often outperforms a heavier one with four-wheel drive. Its air-cooled engine had no radiator, no coolant, no water pump, and no hoses, which on the Eastern Front in winter was an enormous practical advantage, because water freezes and antifreeze was scarce. It was also cheaper and simpler to build than the Jeep in some respects. What it did not have was four-wheel drive, or the Jeep's power and torque, or the ability to tow a light anti-tank gun, or the load capacity for the range of jobs the Jeep ended up doing. But the decisive difference is not in the engineering at all. It is in the last two digits of the production figures. 50,000 Kübelwagen, 640,000 Jeeps. Germany built a good light vehicle in the quantity a good light vehicle is normally built in. The United States built an adequate light vehicle in a quantity that changed what the category was for. When something is that plentiful, it stops being a vehicle that units request and becomes a thing that is simply present. Everywhere, all the time, and commanders start solving problems with it that nobody designed it for. Section 6. What it actually did abundance turned the Jeep into something the specification never described. It carried officers, which is what it was for. Then it began carrying everything else. It laid telephone wire from a reel bolted to the back. It towed the 37mm anti-tank gun, and later trailers of ammunition. It carried a machine gun on a pedestal, and in the North African desert, the British Special Air Service turned heavily armed Jeeps into raiding vehicles that shot up airfields at night. It became the Frontline ambulance with litter racks fitted over the body, and this one mattered more than any other adaptation. A wounded man collected quickly and driven to an aid station has dramatically better odds than one carried out on foot. The Jeep shortened that interval everywhere, on every front, and the number of men alive because of it is uncountable and large. Fitted with flanged wheels, Jeeps ran on railway track, hauling small trains where locomotives had been destroyed. Fitted with a blade, they cleared snow. Chaplains held services using the bonnet as an altar, and there are a great many photographs of exactly that. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent more time with frontline infantry than almost any other journalist, and who was eventually killed doing it, wrote that he did not think the war could be continued without the Jeep, that it did everything, went everywhere, and was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. That is the definition of a force multiplier. Not a weapon that kills more efficiently, but an ordinary object that raises the effectiveness of everything around it. The speed a commander can reach his units, the time a wounded man waits, the distance a message travels, the pace at which a battalion can find out what is in front of it. And because there were 640,000 of them, that multiplier applied to the entire Allied war effort simultaneously, all the time, without anybody having to request it. Section 7. The verdict. So return to the German workshop and the vehicle on the trestles. The mechanics wrote their report, and the report would have said, accurately, that there was no advanced technology in the American light car. The engine was conventional, the metallurgy was unremarkable, the construction was crude in places, A German engineer could have designed a better vehicle in a fortnight, and by several technical measures the Kübelwagen already was won. Every word of that assessment was correct, and it entirely missed the point, which is a mistake that runs through the German evaluation of American equipment generally. The Jeep was not trying to be excellent, it was trying to be sufficient, in a form that could be built by the hundreds of thousands, repaired by amateurs, shipped in crates, and replaced without regret when it was destroyed. Its ordinariness was not a limitation the designers had failed to overcome. It was the specification. This is the same discovery German officers made about the Sherman tank, about American artillery, about the fleet that repaired itself in forward lagoons, and about the divisions that reappeared after being destroyed. In each case, they examined the American object, found it technically unimpressive, said so, and were beaten by it anyway, because they were assessing the object and the object was never the point. The point was the number of them, and the system that put them where they were needed. The German army fought the Second World War with some of the finest machines ever built and never solved the problem of having enough of anything. The American army fought it with a small, noisy, uncomfortable steel box with no doors, and put one wherever a man needed to be. The mechanics were right. There was nothing clever inside it. That was the clever part. The Jeep did not stop when the war did. Willys began building a civilian version almost immediately, and the shape survived. Through decades of redesign, through several changes of corporate ownership, into a vehicle still in production today, whose grille and windscreen and proportions are directly traceable to a specification written at Camp Holabird in 1940. It also created a rival by accident. In Britain after the war, an engineer named Maurice Wilkes was running a war-surplus Jeep on his farm in Anglesey and found himself with a problem. When it wore out, there was nothing British to replace it, so his company built one. The Land Rover went on sale in 1948, and the whole global category of utility four-wheel drive vehicles grew out of those two machines. Tens of thousands of wartime Jeeps stayed abroad after 1945 because it cost more to ship them home than they were worth. They were sold off, given away, and absorbed into the civilian life of the countries they had been fighting in. Some of them were still working decades later. American Bantam, the almost bankrupt little company in Butler, Pennsylvania, that built the first one in 49 days, never recovered from being cut out of the contract. It was gone as a vehicle manufacturer within a few years of the war ending. There is a monument to the original prototype in Butler, and a fairly small number of people who know that the most recognizable vehicle of the Second World War was designed in a matter of days by a freelance engineer who at first was not being paid.